Right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Managing Violence podcast. Today is our very first live interview with another person in studio, as it were, or although this particular time we're not really in the studio, we're actually recording in my new home dojo. So I'd like to welcome one of the directors of the Combat Arts Institute of Australia and a very experienced martial arts instructor, Mr. Ron Amram.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, you will pick up there is some background noise. We're not doing this on Skype. We're not in a nice sterile environment, so please bear with us if there's background noise. It's it'll add to the authenticity of the conversation, I'm sure.
That's right.
All right, Ron, if you can, just for the sake of our listeners, if you just introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background about your story and your experience in the martial arts and in violence prevention.
Sure. So I grew up in Israel and trained in traditional martial arts growing up, mostly in Aikido and karate. I used to compete in fencing a lot, and being a relatively rowdy teenager and going to a pretty rough high school, I just used to get into a few scraps here and there, and found, much like a lot of people who do traditional martial arts, there's a big gap between martial arts and self-defense. I remember the very first time that I kind of got into a scrap and got into like a big, wide kind of karate type stance and got kicked in the balls. And realized that doesn't work.
Yeah, wide stances are good for that.
Yeah. What did work was later when the guy wasn't looking, I tapped him with a shirt, turned around, and I punched him really hard and ran away. And I was like, okay, there's a big difference between what I'm learning and what actually works here. Moved to Australia when I was just before I turned 17. At which point I kind of stopped training for a long time. I was always still into fitness and went to the gym, that kind of stuff. At this point, I also started working as a musician. So I'd be working a lot of late nights in nightclubs and stuff like that. And while I wasn't, most of the time I'd be either on stage or backstage, I wasn't always involved with what was actually going on. But doing it for 10 years, you still see fights on, a few times a night, almost every night.
Yeah, someone asking you to play Masharona for the 15th time.
Yeah, that's right. Or guys trying to jump on stage when you've got a guitar and you're somehow trying to fend them off. On top of just seeing, the bouncers doing their work. So I was doing that for the better part of 10 years and just got a lot of exposure, kind of like just through seeing a lot of it live, to some of the kind of social violence that was going on there. Got back into martial arts and self-defense with Sensei Noah Greenstone probably about 10 or 12 years ago. I can't remember exactly how long ago it was. It was a long time. And that was when I really started getting into more of the self-defense stuff. So we're doing Japanese Jujutsu, Filipino martial arts, but a lot of Krav Maga and a lot of kind of real-world applications. So Noah grew up training in LA under Mike and Meredith, Mike Belzer and Meredith Gold, who you previously had on the show. So I was training with him and kind of went through that. Eventually met Gav Schneider and kind of fell under Gendai Krav Maga. A lot of the training I was also doing with Master Manny D'Amatos, who I've told you about, and I hold in very high respect, and he's got a ton of real-world violence experience. And at some point I remember asking him, what do I need to do to kind of really test this stuff? Because, you can do sparring, but it's not the same. And you can do scenario training, but as good as it is, it's not the real thing. And he suggested I go and get a gig as a bouncer. So I did my course and worked doors for a while. And it was an interesting experiment for me because at this point, I was already close to 30. I had a long-term girlfriend. I had a career as a lecturer in university. I had to, the number of times I had to bounce students who just randomly rocked up where I was working.
You're actually the part of your life where most bouncers retire.
Exactly right.
Normally most of us get out of the game when we get the girlfriend and the job and the responsibilities. You actually went into the job with that.
Exactly right. So I did that for a while, and that was really just as a testing ground to see whether what I was doing was working. I was pleasantly surprised to find, well, not surprised, but pleasantly reassured that it did. And also really taught me a lot of the stuff that I guess we'll get to that later, but I think is probably criminally undertaught in a lot of the stuff that we train in terms of the pre and post.
Yeah, absolutely.
one of the things I was often told, almost on a weekly basis, was, "You're the nicest bouncer I ever met." Mm-hmm. So very rarely did I have to put my hands on somebody, just because I was personable and knew how to talk to people and present options, frame options in a way that they would want to leave.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that you had a job as a lecturer at a university.
Correct.
So just for our listeners' benefit, so what field did you lecture in, and what's your academic pedigree?
So I lectured in finance and professional communications primarily. I did my Bachelor of Business majoring in finance and economics, which I graduated in a long time ago. I can't even remember. I then did my honors with my research being specific to, surprisingly enough, risk and volatility management. So a lot of the same principles apply.
Sure.
You use different metrics, these are different ways to measure it, but really it comes down to, which is the way that I look at self-defense a lot of the time, is risk and return. So I did my honors in finance, and then was working in academia for a long time after that. I also hold degrees I've got a degree in music. I've done a lot of stuff in security and fitness. I've got some qualifications in risk and security management. So I've kind of been in education for a very long time. My parents were both educators. So I used to teach music, and then I taught business, and then I taught fitness for a while, and self-defense, which is why my interest in teaching has always been kind of like at the forefront.
Yeah, and that's something that when we're talking about this show and what we could talk about, what topic would be interesting, you mentioned that talking about how to teach self-defense is a key subject for you, or pet subject for you, because it's interesting listening to you talk, because you've taught across so many different areas that I think it shows a level of competency at the actual art of instructing.
Well, thank you.
Because someone can teach music just by being a good musician, and someone can teach business by being good at business, but if you can teach music and business and fitness and security and risk management and self-defense, there's a good chance that you're actually just a good teacher. So that's why I think this will be a really interesting topic. So for those of you that are playing along at home, the topic that we're really focusing on today is the art of teaching self-defense. So at first it may seem that this isn't relevant unless you are a professional martial arts instructor or self-defense instructor, but I'd like to think that every single person out there that has children is interested in teaching them how to stay safe, and is interested in teaching them some basic life skills. And if you're interested enough to listen to this podcast, you obviously take your own personal safety, and you have an interest in violence that is a feature of your life. So I imagine it's something you want to pass on to your kids and your loved ones and your friends and family. So don't switch off just because you're not a professional martial arts instructor. Everybody is a teacher in some way or another. So that hopefully there'll be elements we can take out of this conversation for everybody.
Absolutely. And I think to add to that, you had an excellent podcast recently about what are the things that you should look for when you go look for a good self-defense school. And I think even as a student, it's really important to know what makes a good instructor, so that when you go somewhere, you have an idea of the quality of the service and the product that you're getting. Yeah. Because there is such a huge variation, and martial arts, self-defense are not a standardized industry. Whether they should or should be is maybe a debate for another time. But having some ideas about what would a good self-defense instructor look like, sound like, what would they teach you, what would they talk about, can help you make decisions that ultimately can affect your safety and how you would manage violence.
Absolutely. So from your perspective, we'll dive right into the meaty subjects. What do you think is the most common failing you see in instructors in the martial arts?
Okay, that is a broad topic.
Yeah. We can talk about many failings.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's just talking about ourselves.
Yeah, that's right. But a lot of it comes from self-failures as well. I mean, when you teach, or at least you should, in my opinion, be very critically aware of what it is that you're doing, and constantly review. I review every session. I'll go home and I'll take notes. What did I do that worked? What it didn't? So, I try and learn from my failings, and I've had many. A couple of things. I know you said one, but I'll pick on a couple.
Yeah, by all means.
So, one of the sayings that I really like by Richard Dimitri and Gershon Ben Karen, who you've had on the show, says something very similar, which is technique is incidental. And you've got an excellent article on your website that talks about the pyramid that we talked about before. So the most important thing in terms of survival and managing violence is your fighting spirit. Mm-hmm. After that, we're looking at physical attributes, experience with violence, and least important is technique. Mm-hmm. But most of the time we look in self-defense, we approach it from the other way around. And that is, I don't know if it's coming more from the expectation of people who come in, mm-hmm. and they say, I got to learn these techniques to be able to do X or Y. Mm-hmm. And that's where the majority of time is spent, and that's what takes the longest amount of time to develop. But where this becomes an epic failure, in my opinion, is where people get locked into this is the right way to do it. Mm. And there isn't any variation in terms of this is the curriculum that we have, and if you step outside the curriculum, you are wrong. Yep. Did I survive the violent encounter or not? That should be the only criteria. Yeah.
There's no style points on the street.
100%. And there's a story that I really like where we have one of our guys who's been training with us for a long time. He's a blue belt in Gendai Krav Maga, which is relatively high in the system. He's been in the Navy for 15 to 20 years. He's not a small guy, right? He's 6'1" to 6'2", 90 kilos, goes to the gym every day, so the dude's a tank. He's done karate or some other striking arts for a long time. Like, he can handle himself, no doubt about that. At some point, he had to move away from Perth. He was living in another city, and he was trying to find another place to train in Krav. And he found one of the kind of big commercial Krav schools and thought, that was the only thing that's available. I'll go train there. Came in as a white belt. They give him the list of techniques. And he trained there for 6 months, went to do a grading, and dropped every single guy they put in front of him. Did not get stabbed in any of the pressure drills, was doing everything ace. And failed because he didn't do it the way that they liked it. Because when somebody runs at you with a knife from a distance, the only thing that you are allowed to do is to throw a front push kick. Right. Nothing else. And, arguable, we get into technique, whatever.
I think Bruce Lee ranted about this in the 60s.
Yeah, exactly right.
And we're still doing it 45 years later, and
Yeah, so, he kind of said thank you very much and left. But that is something that you see so often. That I think that's one of the probably biggest failures. So we look at
being stuck to a curriculum as opposed to an end result.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think self-defense, martial arts is another thing, but self-defense specifically needs to be taught with outcomes and principles in mind rather than techniques. Everything's meant to facilitate that. And then how do you cater for one of the things that we talked about? If you've got a different range of students in terms of age, physical ability, experience with violence, past trauma. Their day-to-day life context is so different.
Sure.
How do you cater to that? And if you stick to a very strict curriculum of techniques, I don't think that that's going to work.
Yeah, and I think it's an extreme example, but it illustrates the ridiculousness of that approach. I've seen I've seen some great videos and articles on returned service people that have come back with missing limbs that have then gone into an art like Brazilian Jujutsu and managed to have success despite having one leg or one arm.
Absolutely.
You're like, well, if you've been graded on how well he could throw a left hook and he doesn't have a left arm, then he's never going to progress in the system.
Exactly right.
But if it's about combat effectiveness and diligence and dedication to learning, then which really should be the key elements. I mean, not everyone's going to be able to do every technique.
Exactly right.
And even some of us, like both of us, have had some significant injuries over the years. Like, there are techniques that I used to be able to do all the time that I just won't do anymore because, like you said, the risk return isn't there. So,
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that also kind of leads to the other huge failure, which we touched on when you and I talked about before, prior to the podcast, which is if we're talking about Krav Maga, contact combat.
Yes.
Everything's got to be done with contact, with resisting opponents, with unpredictable responses. And if you're not training that way, then you're teaching yourself to fail.
It's fantasy.
Absolutely. It works in theory works in theory.
I liken it to swinging your arms around in the air and saying you're learning how to swim.
Absolutely. Yeah, jump in the water and have a go.
Yeah. You don't know if it's working until there's a threat of drowning.
Absolutely. So I think those two things tend to kind of come together. I think that's for me.
Yeah, so the adherence to a strict curriculum and the removal of contact from training.
Absolutely.
We should probably unpack that a little bit, because people that aren't martial arts instructors or aren't in the industry may be confused as to. I talked at length in the last episode, the last couple of episodes, about why contact is important, but perhaps people don't understand why contact gets taken out. And I think you're probably in a unique position to talk to this, because you're a commercial school owner who derives income from student retention.
Oh, totally.
And if you make the class too unpalatable for the average person who walks in the door, then that's going to hurt you financially. So,
without a doubt.
So if you want to just talk on that a little bit, about how you manage that balance between making the classes realistic, but also making sure that they're viable commercially.
Sure. So, and that's a really hard balance. It's also something that, because we try to deliver what we would like to think of as a quality service, we are fairly uncompromising on, which I think is a good thing. So I think there's got to be a couple of things. A quote from Master Manny D'Amatos that I really like is, there are two realities to combat sport or self-defense. And realities are absolutes. I don't like absolutes, but let's use it as an absolute. The first one is, you're going to get hit by another human being. The second one is, you're going to have to hit another human being. If you look at violent encounters, most of the time, those two things are going to happen.
Yes.
And how do you get people used to that? Most people would be uncomfortable with one or the other, or both. And that's probably a good thing. Otherwise, they're probably psychopath. If they derive great pleasure from hurting people or people hitting them, you'd be a bit concerned.
Yeah.
So I think obviously there's got to be some integration of moderation in terms of how much contact you add at different spots. So to start with, it could be something like just light taps. Gradually, as you get better, maybe you're looking at, sparring or with gloves, so the contact is a bit harder, and maybe some, if you're really into it, then you're doing full contact pressure drills, maybe some bare knuckle stuff.
Yeah.
All that stuff is really great.
It's great. It's the early exposure is, it's like teaching someone to swim by letting them walk in the wading pool first, rather than throwing them into a 4-meter deep tank and trying to figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's got to be some desensitization to that. And it's the same when we look at, let's say physical contact, but the same when you're looking at verbal de-escalation, where a lot of the time people go, okay, let's teach you some desensitization. You've got a guy going off at your face from 0 to 100. You go, and people freak out. Then I've never been exposed to anything like that. I've never seen it. They never come back. It's very emotionally draining and scary and unpleasant. I don't want to go to a class when somebody just yells and swears at me for an hour.
Yeah. Why would you pay money for that?
100%. So how do you build that over time? And how do you teach people what are the different stopping points over time and going, now is enough contact and not too much? You can tie that to rank or some form of, again, rank in self-defense, all kind of stuff, discussion for another time. Right? But you can tie that to rank and experience. We are fairly fortunate that at Combat Arts, we've got a range of styles that we teach in the school. So we go, here's Krav Maga is kind of where you put everything together, but if you want to get used to some contact and sparring, we've got sparring classes 5 times a week. Go do some boxing and Muay Thai, jump in with these, and then you're working on your striking anyway. And same thing with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Judo or wrestling, which we also do. Sorry, I'm kind of backtracking and circling a lot, but the problem sometimes with that approach is that then people go, well, why am I paying you to do Krav? I should just do boxing instead, or do BJJ instead. So trying to integrate all of those, so moderate the contact, and I think unpredictable responses and resisting opponents is really the key thing here, that even if the contact is very light, your opponent doesn't always give you the technique, or doesn't do the, what you affectionately refer to as the flying Superman pose, or so things are always dynamic, and that in itself I think adds a lot of value, even without hard contact.
And I think a lesson here for parents, because this is a lesson I learned just recently. I've got 4 daughters. My oldest is 6.5, and just this year I started trying to teach her. Last year I should say. I started trying to teach her some basics of self-defense, and She's just started doing judo now, and she's enjoying it. But it was good for me to apply some of my own, I guess, coaching learnings to teaching her, because I haven't taught kids that young before. And
such a challenge.
It's got to be a game. It's got to be fun. It's got to be something that she looks forward to, or else she's going to hate it forever, and then I'm never going to get a chance to teach her what I think she needs to know. And
absolutely,
I think we sometimes go, well, of course they're kids, but we miss the point that also applies to adults.
100%. I
mean, for an adult that's spending, let's say, $150 a month on self-defense training or martial arts training, that's $150 they could be spending on a lot of fun. That could be a night out, it could be a couple of dinners, it could be, I was going to say DVD rentals, but that really ages me if I say that. it could be a lot of very premium online services.
That's right.
There's a lot of things you can do with $150 that are more fun than showing up somewhere where you're going to get punched in the face.
Absolutely.
So if there's something that's there's things about real self-defense that is sometimes unpalatable, which is like the contact and the aggression and the verbal elements, but a good instructor needs to know how to moderate and regulate that, to introduce it, to drip feed it, so that, like you said, like maybe it just starts with touch drills, where the person is literally just getting tapped on the forehead with fingertips to let them know that their head was exposed, as opposed to being punched. Yeah. And then as they get more comfortable with that, then the inoculation starts to take effect, and you can build up over several years to the point where they're able to spar with full contact.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think it was an interesting learning for me as a parent, just realizing how little I knew about teaching kids until I actually had to teach my own kids. And I thought, man, if my own kids want to listen to me, how are other kids going to go?
I'm dreading the day. I've got a 9-month-old, and obviously I wanted to be able to learn self-defense at some point. I think it's going to have to be done with one of the other instructors. I think it might be hard to be dad and sensei at the same time.
I've actually done that with my kids' judo classes. I refused to teach the class.
Yeah.
So and initially I wasn't going to. Initially I was going to be on the mat, and I thought that would help her. And then my buddy, who owns the judo club, Evo, he said to me, he goes, actually, it'd be better if you give her at least the first month without you on the mat, because otherwise she won't listen to anyone else. She'll just run to dad.
Yeah.
And if she doesn't know how to do something, she'll wait until you come around, where she needs to learn to listen to all the sensei.
Yeah.
And it made a lot of sense. I remembered from teaching kids judo classes, used to happen all the time.
Yeah.
So as a point of that, I've not made myself available for the kids class. And she asked me every week, Dad, are you going to start teaching my judo class now? And I keep saying, oh, maybe not this week. But realistically, I want her to learn from other people, and I can train her at home.
Yeah.
So
if I can just backtrack for a second, because you touched on something that I think is really important, is you said obviously you can desensitize people over a period of time, sometimes years, and that is some of the other problems sometimes you see with self-defense, is that people don't want to spend years. They don't want to. I don't want to spend 5, 10, 15 years to get a black belt to be able to defend myself. Mm-hmm. What if my need is immediate? Mm-hmm. The fear is immediate. That's why they're there. Yeah. And I'm not going to be afraid about this in 5 years. I'm afraid of this now.
Yeah, 100%.
So how do you give them something that they can use, or they feel they can use immediately? Yep. How do you help develop the confidence so they're hard to target straight away, without making them scared and breaking them or making things worse?
I think a lot of that comes down to preparation. And I think if someone has a real and immediate fear and a real and immediate danger, then it's a matter of sitting them down and saying, okay, well, if you want this in the short course format, just be prepared that it's going to suck. Yeah. And that there's no way around this. We have to do this the painful way, because you haven't given us enough time to do it the easy way.
Exactly right.
I remember a job that I had lined up, which thankfully probably never came off. I was looking at doing some international work. I won't go into too many specifics because I'm not sure which side of history I'm on. But I was looking at doing some international work where I had to go to a country in Southeast Asia, and had to serve some legal paperwork on someone who owed some money to some people. And this particular person was protected or associated with people that had a reputation for doing some pretty interesting things with machetes.
Sure. And
we were being hired, or myself and my partner dragged me into this very well-paying but interesting-sounding job.
Yeah.
We were being brought in basically as the muscle to make sure these papers got served. And I remember hitting up Ray Floro, who's an edge weapon specialist in Sydney, who I trained with previously, and I said, Ray, I've got 2 weeks before I go to this country. And I told him the situation, and I said, I need to know everything you know about machete defense. and man, we got after it. We trained hard, but I didn't mind the fact that it sucked, because to me the threat was real and imminent.
Exactly.
And I thought if it saves you once a year, it's a good year, right? If the machete technique works once, it's a good technique.
100%.
So thankfully the job never actually came off, and it didn't end up going. But yeah. I think to answer that question, I think if someone has an immediate fear and they don't intend to train long term, then we just have to have that honest conversation about this is what it takes then. Absolutely.
And I think in terms of a business owner, I think maybe that's why maybe some schools might falter and go, well, we can cater for that, it'll be great, don't worry about it, as opposed to being honest about it and just say, well, it's going to suck.
Yeah.
I'd like to think we're on obviously the right side of the fence.
Yeah.
And I've told people that before.
Well, I think it's the same as if you go to a personal trainer and say, I want to lose 20 kilos in the next 12 months versus I need to lose 20 kilos this month.
Absolutely.
Both things are possible. One of them's going to suck a lot more than the other.
100%.
I think it's just the reality of the situation. And look, sometimes our role is reconnecting people with reality.
That's why I call reality-based self-defense, right?
Yeah, especially sometimes the people most divorced from reality are the long-term martial artists.
100%.
Shout out to everyone like us.
Yep.
All right, so just moving on, one of the things we talked about in the last couple of hours we've been together is how there are certain elements of self-defense and violence management that we both agree are undertaught. We touched on earlier about techniques and how we get fixated on learning techniques and we don't think about learning the pre-incident, the post-incident, and all the other factors, the situational awareness, the avoidance, the de-escalation skills. So I'd be interested to get your opinion or your insight as an educator as to how you think those skills can be taught, because most of us in this industry that become self-defense instructors come from a background where 95% of our training was physical. So we have a pretty good idea of how to teach a front kick. We have a pretty good idea of how to teach a double leg takedown. Teaching someone how to talk, for most of us, was a long-term acquired skill that we learned the hard way. And it's sometimes hard to transfer those lessons. So I'd be really interested to know what you think about how to teach those skills.
Absolutely. So first of all, just like you said, I think, and I'm quoting you, this is stuff that is criminally undertaught in our industry in terms of both the pre and the post. And 95, 99, depends on where you go, is focused on the during. So let's start with the pre, because that's the stuff that...
Yes, there is an ice cream truck going past. So just for anyone who suddenly got hungry, there is an ice cream truck going past the dojo.
Sponsors.
I'm not even going to edit it out just because I love the fact that an ice cream truck interrupted the podcast.
It's great.
Carry on.
What was I talking about? The pre. So let's start with the pre-incident stuff, because I think that's stuff that probably people focus on more. And then if we look into situational awareness and de-escalation, that's kind of where it sits. One of the things that you touched on previously is that people don't often have enough experience, but a lot of instructors don't spend the time in gaining that experience. And for me, that experience was going, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to go get a job as a bouncer. And that's where I learned, I taught professional communication at university for 10 years, but it's very different when you got somebody going off in your face and wants to punch your face in terms of how you communicate with them under pressure. It's not the same thing at all.
Yeah, you couldn't write a strongly worded email back then.
Yeah, that's right. It always reminds me of Team America with that. We're going to be angry with you. And we're going to write a letter telling you how angry we are. So a couple of things. You got to take the time to, as an instructor, to be aware of your own shortcomings and spend the time fixing them. The other thing is it's got to be fun and palatable to a certain degree. So if you're going into a class and shouting at people and kind of dropping all kind of language that people may not be ready for or willing to accept yet, that's where you lose people. And my experience with running a lot of scenario classes in the past has been that was the problem. that when we do verbal desensitization drills, you kind of go from 0 to 100 very, very quickly. It's almost the same as if you're thinking about sparring, where you go, okay, you've done some pad work. Now there's a world champion boxer over there. Go and do a few rounds. Yeah. And, next thing you know, you wake up on the floor going, what happened? Yeah. And it's almost the same thing, as opposed to going, okay, let's do one-touch sparring. Or, so I think that stuff has got to be gradually introduced. Mm-hmm. Some of the things that Mike Belzer and Meredith Gold touched on, which I think are really important, is people have got to be aware and be made aware and repeatedly reminded that it's not personal. Yes. Because sometimes when you're trying to be a bad guy, especially if you don't have an experience in how to be a good bad guy, is you're trying to think of things that will get under their skin. You end up saying things that maybe some real bad guy will say, but they're horribly inappropriate for somebody in their first or second session trying to deal with aggression.
Yeah, I think with that level, that kind of training, the verbal desensitization or inoculation training, or there's a bunch of other terms for it, but to make it effective, you have to be able to go to a personal place, because if you say to someone, I want you to be a real bad guy and try and get an emotional reaction out of someone, but you're not allowed to talk about their race, their sexuality, their weight, it's like, well, exactly right. No one's going to be triggered then if you can't be personal, and the whole point of the drill is to make them triggered so they can feel that rush of emotion and to ignore it or to stay focused. But I do think, I think rushing someone into that is a silly idea, and I think it needs to be 100%, 150% consensual. Like, you need to know ahead of time, this is what we're doing. If you show up, this is what it is, and I'm still going to get consent. And you can still abort at any time during the drill.
Absolutely.
And we'll have safety officers around who will pull it if it looks like it's getting out of hand.
Absolutely. Yeah. Without a shadow of a doubt. And I think the other thing that's got to be added, which I think it needs to be added to anything that you do when you teach, is explain why you're doing it. This is what we're going to do. This is why it's important to do. This is what you're going to get out of doing it. And you got to reinforce it after you've done it. Yeah. Otherwise, especially with all the adrenaline, by the time they get to the end drill, they probably forgot what it was you said at the start.
100%. We used to do these drills quite regularly in seminars, not regular classes, just seminars. And part of my role as an assistant instructor in these drills was to basically walk around and so the way we were structured is we'd have one person who had their hands behind their back, who was the victim, and their only job was to not react.
Yes.
So whereas the bad guy's job was they could do anything, they could say anything they wanted, any language, any racial, homophobic slurs, whatever, it doesn't matter. They were allowed to touch the person's face. They weren't allowed to injure them, but they could pie face them, they could clip them around the ears, they could poke them in the belly, they could do whatever they wanted to do physically, as long as it didn't cause harm. And then basically the defender or the victim's job was to not react to that provocation.
Yes.
And part of our role as the safety officers or the assistant instructors was obviously if someone starts bringing their hands out from behind their back, we pull the drill straight away because it could mean they're about to swing a punch.
That's right.
But oftentimes we would see someone who was physically doing all the right things, but you could look in their eyes and see, no, we've crossed a line.
Yes.
And it's gone too far now. And you never really knew what line it was that caused it, but
the line is different for different people.
Yeah, and sometimes there's accumulation. Like it wasn't something they said; it was just the duration of the abuse.
100%.
And it's funny because from my experience as a bouncer, like people, I used to give points to people if they called me something I hadn't heard before. Because after a couple of years, I've been called everything.
Absolutely.
It's like someone. I remember one guy called me mean, and I was like, oh. No one's ever called me mean before. Because that kind of hurt my feelings a little bit. Actually, I remember the best insult I ever had was I threw a guy out of a club and he said, well, you wouldn't be so tough without your steroids. And I looked at him and I looked at me and I looked at myself. I was like, really? You think I look that good? I was like, you need to set your standards much higher. This is perfectly attainable. I walked away feeling quite pleased with myself that I looked good enough that I was on roids. But coming back to your point about teaching the skills.
Yeah, so people have to know why they're doing it. And I think it's got to come out to anything. One of the things we used to teach in professional communications, when you're writing an essay or when you're making a presentation, the kind of 3 rules that I had is always introduction, body, conclusion, right? Mm-hmm. So tell them what you're about to tell them, then tell them what you told them.
Yes.
And for me, that's the same for class. You start the class, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is how we're going to do it. So you know all the steps. and then tell them while you're doing it, and then when you're done, this is what we're covered and this is why we covered it. So going back to that pre stuff, when we're talking about desensitization, verbal de-escalation, is number one, you gotta gradually introduce them, just like what you do with physical contact. Number two is, I'm going to borrow a phrase from Dave Congerton, who's one of our instructors. He refers to it as having verbal combinations. All right, so you want to have a couple of kind of standard responses that, if nothing else, buy you time, but can work as, springboard phrases or diffusers for kind of standard, especially if you're talking about social violence, the monkey dance type thing, the kind of common attacks, the verbal attacks that happen. So things that you can fire off when you are adrenalized, because you're not going to be able to communicate effectively under stress.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I do practice those over and over again. And one of the things you have to do for that, I feel, is and that's the point where it takes time, is pick very specific scenarios and drill them over and over and over and over again with similar verbal attacks. So you got the similar verbal comebacks.
Yeah. I think sometimes drilling that is so difficult to get right, because the last thing you want is for someone to be scripted, because as soon as someone changes the questions, the answers don't make any sense.
Exactly right.
I know a mutual friend, Rich Dimitri, says it's like rehearsing a date before you have it. And if you have 4 questions lined up for your date, and the example I remember him using was asking the girl, what do you do for work? Do you enjoy it? Do you get along with your boss? Where do you see yourself going with this job? Yeah. And then you ask, what do you do for work? And she says, I'm between jobs at the moment. Oh, do you enjoy it? Well, actually, I'm not really. I'm unemployed. Do you get along with your boss?
Are you listening to what I'm talking about?
This guy's a moron. So if you rehearse and script your verbal dialogue, it can come unstuck. But at the same time, having a verbal IDA almost, like a verbal immediate defensive action. Yeah. Where you can you go, okay, I've heard that. What are you looking at? Or what's your problem? Like, they're very generic things. Totally. You have immediate sort of like a flinch response.
Exactly right. Yeah. Absolutely. So you're totally right. I think that's one of the other main problems with teaching self-defense, is that creating scenarios that are identical is almost infinitely impossible because of the infinite number of variables that happen in real-world violence. No two things will almost ever happen exactly the same. Yeah. But if you look at key variables, there's probably going to be a lot of them that get repeated. Mm-hmm. So, maybe focus on those a little bit more. And if nothing else, and that's kind of what I mentioned when we talked about those verbal combos, if nothing else, even if they just buy you a split second or a second or two to think about where you're going from there, that's still a good thing. Yeah. As opposed to just, getting dumbstruck and going, you're gagging and you're kind of flailing with your arms and you don't know what you're saying, which is, happens to everybody when they do that at first. Yeah. So even if you got something, you can just go verbal IDA.
Just get something happening.
Go from there. Yeah.
I think that's sometimes we say physically that breaking the freeze is the most important part.
Exactly right.
We're talking about, especially when I'm talking to people about home safety and home invasions and things like that. The worst thing or the hardest thing is getting out of the freeze. Yes. And having spoken to a lot of victims of home invasions, that the number of people that tell me the phone was next to my bed and I couldn't even get to it to dial 000. Yeah. Or 911. Yeah. Because I just couldn't make myself move. I was so terrified. Yes. And the most common, or the best advice we can give in that situation is just do something. Exactly right. Even if it's not the thing you should do, just do something. Exactly. Because if you do something, you'll break the freeze and your brain will start working again. 100%. It doesn't matter if you get up and start tap dancing, just do something. Yeah. And I think you see this a lot with predatory violence. Yes. Where a victim is being selected and they're being targeted for a reason. Yes. The predator has a rehearsed spiel, and they will go into their spiel knowing that they'll cause a verbal stun. And Mary talks about this in her episode, where her would-be abductor started the attack with a verbal challenge. Correct. Which made her freeze. Yeah. And the person who freezes and tries to engage intellectually when everything has ground to a halt because they're terrified is like a rabbit in the headlights. Absolutely. And they're ripe for the picking. So absolutely. Yeah, so I really like what you're saying there. What about post-incident? What do you think, what do you teach from a post-incident point of view, and how can the instructor be better at that?
Sure. So, okay, first thing is, and we're talking about, absolutes. I don't, I don't like absolutes, but let's use a couple just in case. The old better to be tried by 12 than carried by 6 thing that every time I hear it, I want to cry.
Yeah.
You got to be
said by someone who's never been tried by 12.
You got to be aware of what like the self-defense laws are in your context, or where your students are, and that's as simple to start with as doing a bit of research. Right, so I think you got to be teaching people about litigation, and that means multiple force options for different situations, because not everything's going to call for drop the guy with a straight right, stomp on his head 10 times. Yeah. The majority of cases won't, especially if we're looking at social violence as opposed to the guy who's going to try and murder you and your whole family. So a bit of research. We got to talk about retaliation, and we got to talk about post-traumatic stress, as well as maybe some first aid. Right. So one of the things that we do is we run fairly regular first aid courses, and we invite everybody to come down. And our instructor, Hilton, he's one of our black belts. He also runs a security company. He's got an RTO, so he does a lot of first aid training. So we tailor it a lot to the type of stuff that happens in the self-defense context. So we kind of run scenarios and work with that. So that's a great start. We talk about the laws of self-defense on a regular basis in class. I think in terms of retaliation and stuff like that, it's more stuff that people have to be aware of. There's no really way you can train that. If somebody's going to come back and find out where you live 3 years down the track, what I mean? Yeah. That probably comes down to more to don't be an ass.
Just be aware and try to conduct yourself with some dignity.
Exactly right. So one of the things that I like to do in those contexts is, if we run through, let's say, scenarios, you practice some drills. Let me run you through the way that I like to do it. Is let's say if we look at a particular, we'll start from a technical base, but let's say an IDA or integrated defensive action, or a 360 or an outside block, whatever you call it, like defending with defense against a circular attack. And it can be high or low, and it can be strike or a tackle. So I give them 2 or 3 options, and then we tell the attacker to make it unpredictable. So you've got these 3 attacks, you don't know which one is coming, deal with it. Give them a couple of different force options for every option, run the drill again, deal with it. Then I'll start tailing that into a scenario. So we might look at adding some verbal de-escalation beforehand, then adding, let's say, another variable if they're advanced enough just to throw something in, or all of a sudden your husband, wife, mom, dad, cat, dog is with you, and you have to be aware of that as well, and use the appropriate force response. The last part of that would be, okay, let's assume you hit the guy and now his head is on the ground. What do you do? Yeah. And you've got, the problem is fitting that in an hour or 90-minute session.
Yeah. And I think, like, just to tag team with you here, my views on that has been that while the post and the pre are incredibly important, they also are skills that are fairly easy to transmit. It's like a lot of it's one-off information, just needs to be touched on every now and then. So,
correct.
For example, use of force law. Once you know it, you know it.
Exactly.
And if you had a refresher every 6 months, or you had to quote it on your grading or whatever,
absolutely,
then you probably know it vastly more than anyone else
correct.
Around you. So, and I think same with situational awareness. There are drills you can do to incorporate that into the warm-up and so on.
Absolutely.
So what I like to do is to have specific seminars, or like a specific class.
Yes.
Where we do, okay, we're going to do 2 hours on post-contact. So come along this Friday night. Come in your regular clothes. We're going to sit down. We're going to have a classroom talk. It's not going to be a sweat session. It's just going to be a chat, and we're going to have some, like, a lecture almost, but a little bit of discussion. And I think we maybe dedicate time to that rather than trying to fit it in with the other drills.
Absolutely, yeah. So we run those kind of workshops, maybe not fairly often, but regularly enough. Yeah. We've also done similar stuff with de-escalation and, sure. Those kind of things. and the good thing about that is those are transferable skills.
Mm-hmm.
So learning first aid is not just when you get into a fight, it can be for anything. Same thing when you're learning how to effectively communicate under stress. That's something you can use with your kids, with your wife or husband, with your friends, with your boss, in any type of situation. It doesn't have to be imminent violence.
Yeah, look, I've been teaching de-escalation for years, still can't de-escalate toddlers. I go straight to the distraction principle. Or I start bribing them.
Yep.
I'll give you $2 to stop crying.
Sometimes we run those as separate workshops. And the other challenge with teaching those is that if people want to come in, they have a good workout, de-escalation is not how you do it.
No, that's right. That's why
you're not going to break the
give them a
sweat.
heads up ahead of time. Like, if you just want to hit the bag, there's going to be an open mat. Come along.
Yeah.
If you want to learn stuff that's actually going to keep you out of jail, come sit in the classroom.
Absolutely.
So Ron, we've got about 10 minutes left before we need a bolt to get you to an airport. I actually wrote an article about this several years ago. How to de-escalate dogs that are barking in the neighbourhood. No,
yep.
It worked. You heard me.
Well done.
I wrote an article about this several years ago about how traditional martial arts schools can add or inject realism into their training without deviating from their art.
Yeah.
So this is something that is very close to my heart because I love the traditional martial arts.
Same.
And I know you do as well. And I think it's something that instructors out there may want to offer something more realistic, but they don't want to lose the heart of their karate or their taekwondo or their aikido or whatever it is. So what are some basic tips that you would give them to inject a little bit of realism, a little bit of self-defense quality into their normal offerings? Sure.
So I think that's a really good question. And we've discussed before, we both have a love for Kyokushin karate.
Mm-hmm.
I've never trained it officially or for, continuously for a long period of time. But I have a lot of friends who do, and I train a lot with Sensei Dave Hughes, who's the head of Kyokushin WA. We have these conversations often about the discussion on kata and bunkai,
mm-hmm.
Application and technique or principle. I think the first point is, and I've come back to it a few times, so I'm going to quote a particular line which I think is important. And it's, again, you find me quoting him quite a bit, for Manny DeMatos.
Mm.
The group of guys that have trained with him for a long time, we're all black belts in a bunch of different things. And he's taught a lot of us on the art of instructing. And one of his sayings that I really like is, you guys are all black belts practitioners, but are you black belt instructors? So one of the things that's got to be important is, if you're teaching something and you call it self-defense, do some research about that application in terms of, if you don't have exposure to real-world violence, look at videos. There's so much that is available, and you touched on that in your previous podcast as well. So educate yourself a little bit about real-world violence. From there, I think a lot of it is about going back to doing, even if it's only a little bit, stuff with contact, unpredictable responses, and resisting opponents. And it doesn't have to be full contact, 100% resistance, and 10 million different responses, but just to add that little bit of element of unpredictability, adrenaline, and some resistance. And those things over time accumulate and make a big difference. That even if that's only 5 or 10 minutes, over time that accumulates, and really you find out what are the things that work and don't work. A lot of the time, that's where you find where the stuff that's really technical, if what you've done sorry, let me retrace that for a second. If you're practicing a very technical move, and when you've done it even only for a few minutes with somebody who is giving you contact, unpredictable responses, and is resisting you, and you've made it work, even if it only looks like an approximation of what it looks like in the kata, then you've nailed it. Because that works.
Yeah, it works.
So I think that's probably the best place to start. Do some research and then look at those 3 components and add them gradually over time, even if only for bits and pieces.
Yeah. And look, I think there are people in our industry, and both of us being Krav Maga instructors, I think the Krav community hasn't earned itself too many friends when people do this, but there's once Krav Maga became popular, And same thing when MMA became
MMA,
popular. All of a sudden, all the ground grappling was already in the kata.
That's right.
And when Krav Maga became popular, it was like, oh, all that stuff's already in the kata. And all of a sudden, people were finding sprawls and and sit-outs and switches and
100%.
Rolling omoplatas in their kata, in their karate kata.
That's right.
Because they're too proud to admit that there was something lacking.
Exactly.
I think that sometimes we haven't earned allies by pointing that out and saying you guys are being ridiculous.
Oh, without a shame. Without a doubt, yeah.
At the same time, as a judo guy at heart, when BJJ guys would tell me they invented the triangle choke, I took great pleasure in showing them a manual from like 1915 that had the triangle choke in it. So I think the point I'm trying to get to here is that there is nothing wrong with being proud of your art. And look, to be honest, the answer to most self-defense situations on a physical level is in your kata. You may have to go and study bunkai. You may have to go and really dedicate yourself and hook up with an expert or whatever the relevant term is for your art. I'm using Japanese terms because I'm not familiar with them. But you may have to really hook up with someone to unpack them. But my suggestion, tagging with what Ron just said, is do the movement that works and then map it back to your system. Don't wait until you find the answer in your system.
Exactly right.
Because the most important thing is that your students are safer now.
Absolutely.
You can map it back later. You'll find something.
Yeah.
But teach them what works now.
Absolutely. So I've actually got an article on my blog. I write quite extensively and have for a long time, where I talk about Venn diagrams and the connection between martial arts, combat sports, and self-defense, right? Which is something more self-defense guys have talked about quite a bit. And where they intersect. So that's exactly kind of the point. Find those intersection points. And it doesn't mean that everything is in that intersection point, but there's going to be a few things, and you got to try and experiment and find the right thing that works rather than go about it the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the key to all of this, is that we should be teaching what works, not what has our
Why
logo
didn't I just
on
say
it.
that at the start?
Yeah, just teach what works, guys. Podcast over.
Check.
Mission
accomplished.
Guys are genius. Keep being good instructors to teach what works. All right, we're gonna start wrapping it up. If people want to learn more about you, your school, your blogs, what have you got to pitch to us?
Sure. So the best thing to go for is probably for our website, which is www.kaya.com.au. It's got a link to my blog there as well, and just look us up on Facebook, Combat Arts Institute of Australia, or Ron Amram. Yep. I answer to both.
Yeah, awesome. And Ron's also contributes to martialjournal.com as well. I've just signed up there as well, so you'll start seeing some articles from me in the near future. So, look, guys, apologies. This episode has been very delayed. I've been moving house and moving into this beautiful new home dojo, which has a house attached to it, and I've been without internet and. Most of my gear has been in a box for the past week. So I apologise that we've been a little bit delayed getting this one out. I'm going to try and drop some bonus content in the next couple of days to make up for it. This one's a slightly shorter interview, but we do have to get Ron to an airport, so that'd
be great.
Just to make sure he actually gets home. But I just want to thank Ron very much for making the time, coming out, spending a bit of time having a chat, having a train with me, and then recording the podcast. Yeah. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me, man. Look forward to a few more, hopefully.
Absolutely. Next time you're in town or I'm over there, we'll do it again.
Beautiful.
Cheers, man.
Thanks, man.
All right, guys, that wraps up episode 9 of the Managing Violence podcast. Thanks for persevering with us through the delay and the lack of episode last week. As I said, I'm going to try and drop some bonus content in the next couple of days just to make up for that. And also thank you for persevering through this rather noisy home dojo studio environment that I'm recording in at the moment. I'm going to be doing some work over the next couple of weeks to try and soundproof things a little bit and get back to a slightly higher quality of sound. But hopefully this is listenable and it wasn't too distracting for you. I look forward to generating some more content. We've got some big things coming in the next couple of weeks that I can't really talk about just yet, but there's going to be some pretty cool stuff on the horizon. In the meantime, stay safe, train hard, and we'll talk to you again soon.